Previously on Crime Adjacent. Detective Ida Jones was still an officer back in 1996 when Bobby Briggs was killed. It was her job to canvass the surrounding area on Cherry Street where his pickup was found abandoned. Did anyone see anything, hear anything, that type of thing? According to her initial notes, which have since made their way into court proceedings and accessed through a public information request by the Crime Adjacent team, she spoke to Jennifer Mewis, owner of Jen's Liquor. It's a squat, standalone cinder block store with a glass front door and a good view of Cherry Street and the small parking lot outside. Every time the door swings open, you can hear the hum and roar of the busy street. Mewis told Jones, "Didn't see anything other than cars, always cars. Some stop, some don't." You can practically feel the shrug in Jones's notes. Jones must have asked if Mewis heard anything because the next line in her notepad says this: "No screams, shouts, shots, nothing." Briggs's truck was found about 50 yards down the street. If Mewis happened to be standing at the cash register and looking out of the front door, the windows were too covered in booze and beer ads, she might have seen something. Maybe. If she happened to be looking at just the right angle at just the right moment when everything occurred outside, whatever that happened to be. Jones's notes reflect that she attempted to recreate this view herself. Her notes said, "Poor visibility, couldn't see a thing." But worst of all, according to the notes, was this, the last line. 5 cameras, inside and out, facing the parking lot in Cherry Street. Only inside working. No footage. Mewis was all Jones could find during her canvass. Mewis was the closest possible witness the night before, on Saturday, January 20th, 1996, but she hadn't seen or heard a thing. The other shops were all closed for the night, and the fast food joints were all too far away to be useful. No motorists called in later. It was as if Bobby Briggs simply disappeared from the middle of town on one of the busiest thoroughfares. He was then taken to the same valley and killed in the exact same horrifying manner. Like I said in the previous episode, Ridgewood no longer shrugged. There was a killer among them, kidnapping people, knocking them out, stomping them to death. If the killer could strike in the middle of town, unnoticed, if he could get Bobby Briggs, a hard-scrabble fighter detested by pretty much everyone, it seemed anyone was vulnerable now. The town would never be the same. Here's the story. But first, a big shout out and thanks to everyone who came to the live show in Seattle last night. Nikki and I were thrilled you could make it, and we had a blast getting to know y'all. But listen, while we deeply, from the bottom of our hearts, appreciate all the tips and leads and well wishes when it comes to the zip tie killer, please remember, he's still out there, and some of y'all have clearly gotten close to this case. We'll find this bastard one day, I promise, but please, be careful. We want to be able to see you at our next live show. That's literally the best part of this entire experience for us, seeing everyone and being together and trying to make sense of the senseless. So there you go, a friendly PSA from one true crime friend to the next. Stay safe out there, because we're all in this together. From San Francisco, this is Crime Adjacent, the never-ending true crime story told weekly. I'm Chase Patrick. Before she went out canvassing the neighborhood for witnesses, Officer Ida Jones stared at the Ford Ranger pickup parked on Cherry Street. This was Sunday afternoon, January 21st, 1996, just a few hours after the body of Bobby Briggs was discovered in the valley by hikers. What stood out to her was the sheer ordinariness of it all, like a still portrait of a modern, everyday slice of life. Pickup at curb. It could be any truck. Anywhere. Cars whizzed by, birds chirped. Jones crept closer. The doors were locked. That stood out. The windows were fine. Peering inside, she could see a $10 bill in the center console. Jones recalled that her brain quickly ran through every possible scenario as more details came to light. This was not a robbery or a fight or a scuffle of any kind. This was just one more vehicle parked at the curb on Cherry Street. That also stood out. The location. This wasn't Hunter Hill, where they found the cars of Tommy and Bobby Calvin. This was Cherry Street in Ridgewood, one of the busiest thoroughfares, crammed chock-a-block with fast food joints, gas stations, car washes, thrift stores, a dollar store. Tommy's auto shop was just a few blocks away. But during their canvass, police couldn't find anyone who saw or heard a thing. It was as if Bobby Briggs was driving along one minute and then the next, simply gone. Jones told me later, "I think that was the scariest thing of all, besides it all happening right there in the middle of Ridgewood. Just this idea that you could be here one minute and then the next, just vanish." Jones said she circled the truck, wondering how Briggs could be kidnapped without so much as a trace of evidence. She heard stories about this guy. No one wanted anything to do with him. So, how? She found her answer immediately. If the rest of the scene was ordinary, what she discovered next was like a revelation that came like a thunderbolt, like one of those cartoon light bulb over the head moments. She'd seen this before. Remember when I told you that the Zodiac Killer featured into this case in weird ways? We're going to start exploring that right now, in this episode, in the next one, and a few down the line as well. Because he kept popping up in this case over and over again for 30 years. Not just because Jones soon became an expert in every serial killer operating in the area. Not just because he was documented at the Hunter Hill rest stop by a California Highway Patrol officer who later wrote a book about the encounter. But also because of what happened here, in Ridgewood, with Bobby Briggs's truck. Officer Jones said, "I couldn't help it. As soon as I saw the tire, I knew exactly where I had seen this before." I'll get back to Bobby Briggs soon enough, I promise. But this diversion is necessary background. Because it's important to understand Ridgewood's place in a region riddled with serial killers, and how one killer could be confused for another, and how their methods could be so similar, especially in the case of Briggs and at least one of the Zodiac survivors. Like I said in the first episode, Ridgewood is a small town, 10,000 or so people, on the edges of the Bay Area, right where the bustle of the urban cities collide with the dusty rural flatlands of the Central Valley. Over the years, Ridgewood seemed to adopt this liminal space as its identity. Urban or rural, grow or stay small, Bay Area or Valley. But if there's one thing Ridgewood had in common with the rest of the Bay Area, it's as a hunting ground for serial killers. The whole region swarms with them, and as I've noted before, Detective Jones said she has spent a lifetime studying them, trying to connect them to Ridgewood. What stumped her was this. No one appeared again and again in this case, like the Zodiac. Still unidentified and anonymous, he grabbed headlines and international attention with a killing spree that officially lasted from 1968 to 1969 and took the lives of 5 people in 4 separate events. He bragged about dozens more in taunting letters to the police and the media. He roamed the entire Bay Area, striking almost at will and sometimes calling the police immediately afterwards to brag about it. He shot and stabbed young couples, first in Benicia and then Vallejo. He killed a cabbie near Leafy Billionaires Row in San Francisco, evading capture by slipping into a fog-shrouded park overlooking the Golden Gate. A cop actually stopped him afterwards, right on the sidewalk, right after the murder. But the first reports dispatched out were about a black man, not a white man. So he slipped away, hiding out in the park near the San Francisco Presidio where kids practice soccer and softball nowadays. When I'm home, I run in this park myself, frequently. When I'm not enjoying the amazing views of the bay and the bridge and Alcatraz, I always think, why here? All of his other murders occurred in Lover's Lanes type places. This is a fancy part of town with big houses and possible witnesses. The Consult podcast, hosted by former profiler Julia Cowley, a brilliant show, highly recommend, recently had geographic profiler Douglas McGregor on to discuss this case. At the time, in the 1960s, the Presidio was a military base and possibly an anchor point for the killer. Did he feel safe there? Like the killer knew he could easily escape into a place he knew well because perhaps he was stationed there? Conjecture, sure, hunches and best guesses, but Maybe. Who knows? If you scroll out, it's hard to pin down a pattern to his murders. The first two murder events involved couples in lovers' lanes. They were shootings at night. The San Francisco murder was a shooting as well, but like I said, of a cabbie, not a young couple, on a quiet street, not a lover's lane. What occurred in Napa County, maybe 20 miles from Ridgewood, was entirely different. There, at Lake Berryessa, he donned a black square mask with a crosshair symbol, like a paper grocery sack turned upside down and planted atop his wide shoulders. He tied up a young couple out for a picnic on the peaceful oak-studded shores. He said he was there to rob them, but once subdued, he stabbed them mercilessly. The young woman later died while the young man crawled for help. Remember this particular murder. I'll come back to it a lot, in greater detail. Like Briggs's truck, it factors into this case as well because for a brief moment in 2023, investigators wondered if the Zodiac himself had re-emerged to kill at the same location all over again. Or maybe he never even stopped. Detective Jones said she looked deeply into this theory, whether he never actually stopped, whether he was actually still alive, whether he, the Zodiac, was actually responsible for the Ridgewood murders. Jones said, "There are just so many rabbit holes with this case at this point. Pick a theory, any theory, and you can find someone online with so-called evidence to support it." Jones knows that the official list of murders stands at 5 victims, but in letters to newspapers, the killer claimed many more, all over the Bay Area and the entire state. And those letters, real or hoaxes, continued to haunt the Bay Area well into the 80s and even into the 90s. Jones told me, "I would have been a fool not to look at him, even though you actually feel like a fool for doing so. But the thing is," Jones paused. I could see her debating how to say it. She finally shrugged. She said, "It's not as ancient history as people made it out to be, especially back in the 90s. As far as we knew, he was still out there. Nearby jurisdictions like Vallejo and San Francisco were performing new DNA tests. At the moment, he felt almost catchable." These letters, I remember them well. Jones does too. The killer sent ciphers and threats and taunting letters to the police and newspapers following his murders. You can find them online and read them for yourself. ZodiacKiller.com is a great clearinghouse. Officially, his letters were thought to have stopped in 1974. But growing up in Ridgewood in the 1980s, this is just a few towns over from Vallejo and just a few rolling hills away from Lake Berryessa. I remember many more. As a child, they seemed like hazy, vague threats. Adults tried to keep this information from us kids at the time, going full Maggie Smith and Good Bones on us. This place is beautiful, right? You could make this place beautiful. But while they were trying to sell us the world, in that vacuum of sanitized information, all that gossip and all those stories swirled around at kid level and half-heard stories, becoming worse than the truth, to be honest. Don't mess with the imaginations of children. One of those suspected letters came in 1986. It was mailed to the San Francisco Chronicle. I remember a buzz about it. "This is the Zodiac speaking," it began, like so many of the others. He claimed 2 more victims in the Sacramento area, which was only a few miles from Ridgewood, connected by I-80. This letter and these murders have not officially been linked to the Zodiac by law enforcement. But the letter I really remember came in 1987. This one was mailed to the Vallejo Times-Herald just a few days before Halloween. The message was blunt. "Tell the kiddies watch before they cross the street on Halloween night." The letter promised the author would be out in a, quote, death machine, looking for children to run over. That's why I remember it. It created fear and panic all over the Bay Area. Parents organized patrols in Ridgewood. They roamed the streets with trick-or-treaters, some quietly armed, on the lookout for, well, anything. No one knew. A strange man? A death machine? What does that even look like? People assume they'd know it when they see it, and well, they were probably right. Later, I'd learned that similar precautions were taken all over the Bay Area. I cannot stress enough just how mildly scary it was growing up in the Bay Area in the 1980s, like a baseline of persistent, throbbing danger with stories of strange men prowling suburbs and cities. They could be anyone, anywhere, and adults didn't like to say anything about it, only that we were safe, which again only made matters worse. The Zodiac had always taken pleasure in the idea of killing children. Back in 1970, he claimed he'd shoot out the tires of a school bus and pick off the kiddies as they came, quote, bouncing out. Why? Back to the consult pod again. Together with Michael Butterfield of the podcast Zodiac A to Z, they dove deep into this case and have some theories that make sense. If, officially at least, the killer stopped after the murder of Paul Stein, the cabbie near the Presidio, the letters stood in as a way to unsettle the community, one of his main goals. Whether it was killing kids at lovers' lane spots, or a cabbie in a wealthy area of town, or threatening to kill children as they were bounding off buses, he was letting people know he could be anywhere, could kill anyone at any time. Cowley, from the Consult Pod, again, highly recommend, said like many serial killers, this was all part of his fantasy of control and domination and to have the upper hand. Honestly, it worked. People lost their shit all over the Bay Area, not just back in the 60s, but into the 70s and 80s. There is conflict about whether this letter and later letters were hoaxes. It depends on who you ask and who your favorite suspect is. Still, Jones kept a close eye on the killer, citing the letters and similarities between Ridgewood and the Zodiac. She couldn't have known it at the time, but there was another letter in 1990, just a few years before the Ridgewood murders began. It was mailed to the Chronicle again and took the form of a taunting Christmas card. The thing is, this 1990 letter wasn't actually discovered until 2007 in the newspaper archives. It had slipped through the cracks for 17 years. Jones said she couldn't help but wonder, was the Zodiac still out there at the time of the original Ridgewood murders in 1995 and 1996? After all, in one of his letters, he promised to change his M.O. In fact, he was thought to be the Santa Rosa hitchhiker killer at one point. That involved a man who killed 7 women from 1972 to 73 and dumped their bodies along freeways probably 60 miles or so from Ridgewood. Just go down I-80, take Highway 12 to Highway 101, and you're there. An hour and a half, tops. Like I explored in an earlier episode, all these roads, they connected towns to each other, yes. They made travel so easy, made long commutes and new jobs and new communities possible. But just how much of a role did they play in making the Bay Area such a lighthouse for murder? Jones said she never really ruled out the Zodiac. As she found out, one key suspect lived in Vallejo, where Hunter Hill Rest Stop is located. One lived in Fairfield, the next town over. If the Zodiac murdered people in Lake Berryessa, it's possible he passed through Ridgewood. Like others in law enforcement or even internet sleuths, she could never find that one piece of evidence, but it seemed possible. But the wild thing is, the Zodiac was not the only serial killer once thought tied to this case, who drove right through Ridgewood on a regular basis and probably knew the valley just off of Interstate 80 well. Beginning in the late 1970s, the Golden State Killer, a one-time cop by the name of Joseph D'Angelo, began a murder, rape, and burglary binge that would terrorize hundreds up and down the entire state. They first called him the Visalia Ransacker for his spree of break-ins in the Central Valley, a few hundred miles south of Ridgewood. He would soon draw closer, however. He moved to the Sacramento area, just 20 miles away, and began sexually assaulting girls and women. There, he became known as the East Area Rapist and would also begin targeting the Bay Area. From 1976 to 1979, D'Angelo hunted towns from Sacramento and Rancho Cordova, about 30 miles east of Ridgewood along Interstate 80, to Walnut Creek and Concord, about 30 miles west of Ridgewood. Interstate 80 connects them all. It connects everything. If you drive along Interstate 80 in the Bay Area, you are 100% following the path of serial killers. And the Golden State Killer? Jones said his travels would have brought him directly through Ridgewood for years, directly through the valley on the outskirts of town. Did he keep it in mind for later? Detective Jones said she checked. It seemed unlikely, possible, but unlikely. You see, D'Angelo seemingly retired after one last murder in 1986, falling off the radar until esteemed crime writer Michelle McNamara meticulously pieced together a portrait of the forgotten killer. Police were able to use DNA in a genealogy tree to finally identify and capture the man, who went about his days as a retired store clerk in a tranquil Sacramento suburb. Find more details at the brilliant podcast, Buried Bones, hosted by Kate Winkler-Dawson and Paul Holes, the cold case investigator who contacted a DNA genealogist, Barbara Ray Venter, to ultimately identify D'Angelo. There were others Jones looked into. In the pantheon of Bay Area killers, the Night Stalker stood out. Any Bay Area resident in the 1980s can recall Richard Ramirez and the fear he brought to the region. From accounts of survivors, police cobbled together a composite sketch that stopped breath in the throat. Like people can recall where they were when Kennedy was shot or when the Challenger exploded, I can remember with precision exactly where I was when I saw his wanted sketch. I was standing in the kitchen, staring at the Ridgewood recorder spread out on the wooden table, just gaping in horror at the image. It sent a chill down my spine and was probably the first time I understood evil in the notion that there is danger outside of the home, just as much as there is inside of it. But at the time, I had no idea just how many killers there were and how much they would impact my life. In the newspaper composite sketch, Ramirez looked like a deranged, bug-eyed alien with wild curls and sunken cheeks, a meth-addled, self-proclaimed Satan worshiper who crawled through open windows on steamy summer nights to rape and shoot sleeping residents in their beds. Young girls, elderly women, single men, no one was safe. While most of his late-night break-ins occurred in Los Angeles, Ramirez lived for a spell in San Francisco and traveled back to the Bay when the police drew too close. In fact, his first murder was in San Francisco in 1984, before his spree began in LA. From 1984 to 1985, neighborhoods organized watch patrols. Families purchased guns and laid up on baseball bats and hammers. I remember that children were told to stay inside to watch for strange men and strange cars. Alarm sales went through the roof. It was all eerily familiar to the Zodiac Halloween letter and what would happen just a decade later in Ridgewood when the rest stop killer emerged for the first time. In August 1985, a group of elderly women at a convenience store in East Los Angeles recognized Ramirez from media accounts, and a pursuit by a slowly awakening neighborhood commenced. "That's him," they whispered, "El Matador, the killer." Ramirez bolted from the store. He attempted a carjacking but was quickly subdued by an angry mob wielding bats, wrenches, and fence posts, whatever they could get their hands on. These are all different cases, and Jones found they don't always converge with the Ridgewood murders. But the atmosphere of violence and destruction they create was palpable, relentless. What I mean to say is that in every decade, the Bay Area feels gripped by terror over and over again. Another killer, another murder, another family torn apart. The zip tie killer. I'm sure he's listening. Nikki still gets letters. He lets her know he's still out there. But like I mentioned at the live show in Seattle, you know what? So are we. We've endured, Nikki and me, and here we are, with you. Also, please remember what I said at the top. Be careful with this one. We appreciate all the tips, but let Nikki do her thing. As she frequently tells me, his days, they're numbered. She'll track him down again. No one is sure exactly why the Bay Area attracts so many serial killers, or even why they seem to emerge with a vengeance when they did. Beginning in the 1960s, serial killing exploded in the United States, and so did trying to define it. I promise I'm going to get back to Bobby Briggs soon enough. But y'all, this is a wild story. I truly don't know why I like it so much, but I'm an unrepentant, curious nerd, so it's probably that. It's probably always that, to be honest. In 2005, in San Antonio, Texas, the FBI held a, quote, serial murder symposium, complete with breakout sessions, keynotes, and panels on serial murder forensics, history, and prosecution. It just makes me chuckle, like, let's all gather at the airport Hilton and nail these bastards over a continental breakfast. It sounds so mid-level corporate, like something out of Office Space or Parks and Rec, when the topic is anything but. Figuring out why this country, in numbers not seen elsewhere, is riddled with serial killers. One of the first profilers, Robert Ressler, once called serial killing as American as apple pie. Fun times. So nailing down a definition of serial murder became key to this symposium. It used to be anywhere from 2 to 3 to 10 murders that counted. It was all over the place, depending on the agency or who was making the call. A 1998 federal law, the Child Sexual Predator Act, defines serial murder in a way only Congress can, with a wordy legalese paragraph that put the number of required victims at 3. I think. I had to read it a few times. This FBI symposium narrowed things even further, publishing its findings, which you can read online yourself, and detailing for the first time what it hoped would be a universal definition of what it means to be and to look for a serial killer. From this report, signed by Robert Mueller himself, came this definition. Serial murder, the unlawful killing of 2 or more victims by the same offender or offenders in separate events. With this definition in mind, tracking became more prevalent. A 2016 study by Radford University reveals the number of serial killers rose from 72 in the 1950s to more than 200 a decade later. By the 1970s, it was 605, and then nearly 800 in the 80s. Radford University keeps a running list of them. You can find it online. In fact, Professor Mike Amott wants to tweak this definition still to distinguish between, say, a mob hit and the sexual sadist serial killer so often linked to the public imagination. TBD. The FBI Symposium offered a brief history of serial murder, detailing how Jack the Ripper first grabbed the public's fascination in the 1880s with taunting letters to police about his murders of sex workers in London. FBI profiler John Douglas posited in Mindhunter that serial killers have always lived among us, that the monsters, goblins, and werewolves of fairy tale lore were, in fact, early serial killers at work. Villagers simply couldn't believe their own neighbors could commit such horrors, and so they made up these enduring tales of monsters. Sounds familiar? The monster next door is a trope in true crime at this point, when really, 90% of the time, it's men. But why the dramatic upswell at the tail end of the 20th century, and why the growing gender divide? Before the 1900s, serial murders were basically split 50-50 between men and women, according to the database. There are theories. Social malaise, violent media, interstate roadways and accessible victims and easy escape routes, a country churning with social change that saw women, the usual targets, gaining more freedom while violent men, the usual killers, could not abide it. Or maybe, at least when it comes to the gender divide, women could simply divorce their husbands and no longer had to quietly kill shitty spouses to escape abuse. Or maybe all these murders are simply because law enforcement finally had a term for repeat killers and the statistics reflected that. Whatever the reason, their numbers swelled like a horrible tide, and the Bay Area became a tragic lure for a relentless, crashing surge of humanity's worst. I've mentioned the Zodiac and the Night Stalker and the Golden State Killer and the I-5 Strangler. There was also the Trailside Killer, who operated in Marin County, the Co-Ed Killer in Santa Cruz, the Doodler in San Francisco, the Hitchhiker Killer in Sonoma Wine Country. The region practically vibrated with suspicion and an incessant, pulsing malevolence. Amidst this crushing atmosphere of violence, no one felt safe, especially in Ridgewood, especially after Bobby Briggs was taken. You don't hear this a lot in true crime, but practically everyone who had the misfortune of running into Robert Bobby Briggs had something horrible to recount. Like I mentioned in the previous episode, his wife, Becca, told the Ridgewood Recorder just days after his death, he was an absolute asshole of the highest order. I would have found it almost comical if Bobby Briggs, Briggs from here to avoid confusion with Bobby Calvin hadn't met such a wicked end. In years of reporting on true crime, neither Nikki nor I have ever met a victim who cast such a wide and disagreeable shadow. Usually people regard victims as veritable saints, the absolute nicest people in the world. A true shame. Salt of the earth, what a loss. You grow accustomed to the patterned niceties. No one spoke ill of the dead. But even Briggs's family thought Earth was a better place without him on it. His father, Steve, told me he was surprised someone hadn't killed his son earlier. Briggs robbed, stole, drank, cheated, not just on the women in his life, but everyone he came into contact with. Briggs once pinched an entire table of Girl Scout cookies in Davis, California, right outside a grocery store, and was immediately tracked down to his pickup, where an officer forced him to return the cookies with apologies. But the young girls and their mom didn't wait for one. They didn't want to be around Briggs for any longer than was necessary. They packed up and fled. Keep the cookies, they said. So who is this guy? And how did he cross paths with a killer? Bobby Briggs was born in Grants Pass, Oregon in 1967 to a family of long-haul truckers. Instead of school, he joined them on hauls around the country. Milk, gas, chemicals, it was a highly skilled profession of measurements and cleaning systems and sterilization. It was also endless time on the road. His father, Steve, said, "Probably not the wisest thing in the world, in retrospect." He still lives in Grants Pass. I spoke to him over the phone. For a few short years, however, Steve said it seemed like a good idea. Life on the road as one big, happy family, exploring America, seeing all the sights. The open road, the magical vistas, freedom and being together. They, quote, homeschooled Briggs with books bought at thrift stores and lectures from other truckers on the CB radio, which Briggs loved. I can imagine, honestly, it hits that Smokey and the Bandit vibe I remember from childhood. Like, cool in a way I didn't fully understand. Then Briggs turned 10, and things changed. Steve laughed darkly, but not really. We started wondering if we could just drop him off at a gas station or rest stop, he said. Briggs had become belligerent, fought, bit, ran away a few times. Truck stops, seedy rest stops, weird makeshift friendships with lot lizards, as they called truck stop sex workers at the time. Steve said he couldn't really understand it, like a switch was thrown in his son. He regrets the lifestyle now, wondering if the lack of friends and changing environment and life on the road with CB lessons about aliens, Elvis sightings, and government conspiracy theories just wasn't good for a small boy, and something happened. At age 12, Briggs must have had enough as well. One day, he simply walked away. Steve is not sure exactly where or when, but the boy simply walked away at a rest stop or a gas station, he said. He couldn't be sure. The 70s were also a time of easily accessible drugs, lax monitoring, and driving shifts that could stretch well over 24 hours. Steve said he just couldn't recall. He thought his son was simply dozing off in the rear sleeper section of the cab, and then Steve looked back and there was nothing. The boy was gone. I didn't delve too deeply into Steve's parenting choices because, honestly, it didn't seem all that strange to me. That may seem young for most people, 12, but I had to admit a certain amount of kinship with Briggs. I was 12 when my parents kicked me out. I imagine he did exactly what I did. He survived. He survived any way he could, and did, in fact. I had the good fortune of running into Susan one morning. She provided a home. She did the same with Nikki a year later. She had done the same for about a dozen social cast-offs over the years before us. We were her last. But for a few short, wonderful years, we had a loving, makeshift, happy family that loved nothing more than curling up on the couch each Sunday for new episodes of Murder, She Wrote, Susan's favorite. No wonder her kids are doing this now. From what I could tell, Briggs had no such luck. He hitched and bumped and stumbled around the entire West Coast, stealing when he could and taking odd jobs when he couldn't. Ridgewood was not home for long, and no one is quite sure exactly when Briggs rolled into town. What is known, however, is that he took an endless run of seasonal gigs around town, from hauling tomatoes for a company out of Dixon to drying or canning fruit in Fairfield. His wife, Becca, said he wasn't into holding down a typical 9-to-5. They'd been married for about 6 months at the time, having met at the Applebee's, where she was a waitress, and he tried to run out on a tab. Love at first sight, I guess. I'm sorry, my apologies, won't happen again. Anyway, Becca said, I don't know, there was just something about him. Like Tommy and Bobby Calvin, Briggs was also handsome, but in a wiry, sort of dangerous way, like a bad boy. In my interview with Becca, I got the sense all the excitement had worn off by the time Briggs was abducted, and that she was almost relieved. She didn't say that. I'm intuiting here. When Briggs became a victim of the rest stop killer, police wondered if he was a closeted gay man like Bobby Calvin or Tommy Coulet. They wondered if his posture of hypermasculinity might have been an act of reaction formation. Little guy, big truck, violent displays of overcompensation. Becca shook her head in disagreement. Definitely not gay. No sir, no way. As evidence, she pointed to his porn collection and what he wanted to do in bed and who he wanted to include there. Definitely not gay, Becca declared. So, not gay then. But according to the medical examiner, Briggs was killed in the same manner as Tommy and Bobby. Again, be warned, it gets graphic for a bit. I'll be brief, but the details in all these murders become key later on. They're subtle, like clues only Jessica Fletcher might pick up on. The autopsy revealed that there was bruising on the back of his head. He'd been knocked out, cold. There was also the same extensive damage to his thoracic cavity, and his lungs flooded with blood and microscopic bone chips, which traveled around the network of alveoli long enough to let investigators know the killer stomped him half to death, and then, like in the case of Bobby Calvin, simply stopped to watch. Was it blunt force trauma? Drowning? In his own blood? Both? Medical examiners couldn't say. The killer then cut away at his clothes, securing a special token just as he did in the other murders. Briggs was even discovered in the same valley outside of town. Not, if you're wondering, by Daniel Palmer this time. Palmer is the developer who owns most of the valley and discovered the bodies of Tommy and Bobby Calvin. With Briggs, hikers stumbled across his body much closer to the lake than the other two men. This is where the similarities ended. If, as Becca argued, Briggs was not a closeted gay man, that was the first big difference. But most importantly, like I mentioned at the top, police discovered his truck abandoned on Cherry Street in downtown Ridgewood, just a few blocks from Tommy's auto shop. Jones and Detective Al Williams, her boss, and now chief, they had always surmised that the killer was a local man, given his knowledge of local roadways and secluded makeout spots. And they had also wondered if he had, in fact, stalked his victims, following them to Hunter Hill, rather than simply meeting two separate, unconnected Ridgewood residents there by happenstance. I thought the killer had simply waited at Hunter Hill for the right victim to appear, but I may be wrong. I admit Jones had a point after Briggs was found. That Briggs's truck was discovered in Ridgewood confirmed the theory, for some, that the killer was local who stalked his victims around town. But it also scared the hell out of them. People wanted to know, why here? Why Ridgewood? The town seemed so small and peaceful, like a dot on a map people simply passed through on the way to the Bay Area or to Lake Tahoe in the other direction. Why had the killer chosen such a small, forgotten town? And how had he managed to get Briggs? Joan said she saw the tire on Briggs's truck and knew the answer immediately. Next time on Crime Adjacent. In 1970, the Zodiac killer stopped a motorist in the Central Valley, not far from Ridgewood as the crow flies. He waved her down late at night, flashing his lights on the rural highway, and said her tire was loose and that he'd fix it for her. A real gentleman. Instead, he actually loosened her lug nuts and then trailed behind, waiting for the wheel to wobble free. He then pulled up again, offered a ride, just a friendly stranger on a lonely road late at night, happy to help. The connections between this event and the kidnapping of Bobby Briggs were striking. Remember to review and like Crime Adjacent wherever you listen to podcasts. And check out our Patreon page to unlock ad-free listening, bonus information, or to become part of our true crime and criminal profiling reading group. Until next time, this is Chase Patrick from San Francisco with a reminder, you'll never unhear what happens next.